Welcome to this event. It's one of the events that we organize with Centro Primo Levi, the Italian Cultural Institute, the Italian Consulate in New York, and many other Italian organizations here to mark il Giorno della Memoria, the day of the Holocaust Remembrance that happened on January 27th. But as it is tradition here in New York, we sort of extend that day to a series, actually, of dates in which we present different aspects that are somehow connected, somehow sometimes even not in a so explicit way, to the Day of Remembrance. These specific events couldn't be more clearly associated, and we have the pleasure to introduce to the American public the English translation of a fundamental book in the history of fascism, that is Mussolini's Camps, Civilian Internments in Fascist Italy, 1940-1943. The author, Professor Carlo Spartaco Capogreco from the University of Calabria, is here with us tonight, and he will discuss it with Silvana Patriarca of Fordham University, Rudolf Mrazek of the University of Michigan, and the panel will be moderated by Mary Gibson of CUNY Graduate Center and the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Why this topic? Why did we choose this topic? First of all, because Professor Capogreco's book is a fundamental contribution to the historiography of fascism. It debunks many myths, amongst which that, after all, Mussolini was not that bad, and that the camps in Italy were not that bad, and that nothing in Italy ever is that bad. We can laugh about it, but it's something against which we and I talk about my colleagues at the Centro Primo Levi, the Istituto di Cultura, have been fighting for quite a long time. Because this myth of believing that there is an Italian exceptionalism to what happened is a very dangerous myth. The idea that Italians were somehow better in that context is a very dangerous myth. And what we need to debunk the myths are books like the book by Professor Capogreco that is really a very thorough, in-depth analysis of the historical phenomenon of civilian internment during fascism. Copies of Professor Capogreco, because actually there is one copy and then there are flyers through which you can order his book in English if you wish to do so on the table at the entrance. And while you are upstairs after our panel discussion, I strongly invite you and encourage you to take a look at the exhibit that you see up. It's a documentary and artistic exhibit that features a Jewish Italian artist, Leo Ieni, that was born and raised in Italy, had to live through a series of many adventures that make him not unique, but rather exemplary of the experience of many other Italian Jews that at a certain point had to leave their own country to go somewhere else. There is a section within the exhibit that are sketches and drawings of internment camps, so it couldn't be more fitting and more connected to this presentation tonight. And then there are paintings that he did later on in his life when he established himself here as a painter in New York City. And also I wanted to remind you that this coming Thursday, February 6th, we'll have our final event related to the Giornata della Memoria, and it's entitled Modernity, Fascism, and the Resistance. And it's an evening with documentarian Yamane de Messier, and it's about how 4 Ethiopians confronted, maneuvered, and survived the Ito-Ethiopian War. So again, the idea of memory and recollection of the crimes of fascism extends even beyond the limits of the Shoah to include also the colonial wars of the fascist regime. So please take a look at the exhibit upstairs. Come back on Thursday for the conversation with Yamane de Messier. And I would like now to ask you to please welcome a partner that we have worked with for a long time and very productively, I have to say, and the Deputy Director of the Centro Primo Levi, Alessandro Cassin. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Stefano. Thank you to Casa Italiana. It's always a pleasure to be here. I won't name all the partners in this Giorno della Memoria as Stefano has done already, but I would like to acknowledge the presence of Exactly. I'd like to acknowledge Paolo Barlera from the Italian Cultural Institute, and yes, as you heard from Stefano, we're here to celebrate the publication of Carlo Spartaco Capogreco's seminal work, now finally available in English. It was published by Routledge as Mussolini's Camps, Civilian Internment in Fascist Italy, as you can read here, and unfortunately has a very high price. That's why we have a discount coupon upstairs for anybody interested in buying it. It is a particular honor for me to introduce this program tonight, 10 years after Centro Primo Levi first presented Capogreco's research on Mussolini at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, again on a Sunday afternoon 10 years ago. We did not expect to have an audience at all. We had 400 people there. And I see that this topic continues to be of interest to many of us. Others will discuss the merits of this watershed book. Allow me a few personal considerations. Capogreco's approach has guided, in many ways, Centro Primo Levi's work and reflection on the topic over the years. When it first appeared in Italy, the book allowed us to go beyond the trappings of thinking of Mussolini's camps primarily from the narrow perspective of Italian history. Mussolini's complex concentratory system, comprising over 200 locations scattered everywhere in Italy and extending to Yugoslavia, Libya, and East Africa, deserves to be studied on its own, and yet must be understood in a European and international context. From early colonial times through World War II, and unfortunately to the present, many nations have chosen to segregate and intern in camps sections of their own population and or foreign citizens. The designation of January 27 as International Holocaust Remembrance Day was progressively adopted by European nations starting in 1996, culminating in 2005 when it was taken up by the United Nations. Our hope, everybody's hope, decades after the end of World War II, was that it would be possible to rethink, if not accept, conflicts of memories among competing national narratives, at least within Europe. Sadly, this has not been the case. Despite the proliferations of museums of memory, memorials, and countless educational efforts, in fact, too often the history of totalitarianism and World War II continues to be explained through narrow nationalistic lenses. What I want to bring to your attention tonight, what I have learned from Capogreco's research, is that Mussolini's practice of segregation and interning civilians deemed dangerous or expendable needs to be condemned regardless of whether it was also carried out by other nations or whether Italian camps were more rigid or more permissive than those of other countries. Once a government feels the right to set up camps where people are stripped of their liberties, their citizenship, their aspiration and dreams, the whole society becomes complicit in the enterprise. It is not, or not only, a question of whether internees are killed or tortured. It is a question of understanding what happens to anyone deprived of his or her rights and forced into an existence beyond the protection of law. The damage endured by internees in terms of loss of freedom, mental and physical health, hope, financial opportunity, and outlook on life is unaccounted for. Needless to say that reparations are never contemplated and probably not possible. So I would like to dedicate this program and my thoughts to all those who have been interned and are still living in internment today. Let me introduce, and I invite whoever I mentioned first to sit here, our guests tonight, starting with Mary Gibson. Mary Gibson is a professor emerita of history at John Jay College and the Graduate Center. She's the author of two classics, Born to Crime, Cesare Lombroso, and The Original of Criminology, and Prostitution and the State in Italy, 1860-1915, and more recently, of Italian Prisons in the Age of Positivism, which was published last year. If you could please take a seat, Mary. Okay. Silvana Patriarca is professor of history at Fordham University. She specializes in the history of modern Italy, and in particular in the cultural history of nationalism and the construction of national identities. She is the author of award-winning Numbers and Nationhood, Writing Statistic in 19th Century Italy, and of Italian Vices, Nation and Characters from the Risorgimento to the Republic. Currently, she's completing a book entitled The Color of a Republic, War, Children, and Racism in Post-Fascist Italy. We're happy to have Rudolf Mrazek, who is Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Michigan, and the author of several books, including A Certain Age, Colonial Jakarta Through the Memories of Its Intellectuals, and Complete Lives of Camp People, Colonialism, Fascism, Concentrated Modernity from 2020. And of course, Carlo Spartaco Capogreco, who is one of the foremost international experts on the history of civilian internment during fascism. Currently, he is professor of contemporary history at the University of Calabria and scientific advisor for the Centro for Contemporary Jewish Documentation in Milano. His publications include the first studies of the concentration camps of Ferramonti and Renici, and the critical edition of Maria Eisenstein, L'Internata numero 6, who many of you heard expert from the other night at the Italian Cultural Institute. Capogreco is among the contributors of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, published by Indiana University Press in 2018, and the main anthologies on fascism and the Shoah in Italy. Please welcome our guests.
So I think I'll go first. I'm pleased to be part of this panel presentation tonight of the English translation of the book by Carlo Spartaco Capogreco. And I want, first of all, to thank Natalia Indrimi and the Centro Primo Levi for inviting me to be here. As a co-editor of the Routledge series in which the translation is published, I am also glad to have the opportunity to thank the author for his willingness to be included in the series, because originally the book was going to appear in another series, but we're happy that he has allowed us to open the series with this very fine book. The series is called Studies in the History of Modern Italy, and it aims to make available to the Anglophone public some significant works of Italian historiography published in Italy in recent years, as well as the new and innovative works on modern Italian history not yet published. And we want to try to make these works, especially those, again, those who have not been translated yet, known here in the Anglophone world. Because often there is not much, there is not much knowledge, there are not many translations being done, and we want to promote more exchange between different scholarly traditions. Capogreco's book deserves to be, more than others, to be known outside of Italy as one of the most significant contributions to the Italian historiography of fascism, a contribution which rejects the banalization of fascism, which many have pursued in Italy, particularly since the 1990s, when the heirs of fascism, for the first time, became part of a government of the Democratic Republic. So, the book is also important, not only because it's an incredible work of research, but also because it addresses the question of memory holes. of what has been missing for a long time in the national memory of Italy. And in the little time that I have today, I want to say a few things about this issue. Mussolini camps originally appeared, as we said, in 2004, and it has just been reprinted. Capogreco began to study these forgotten places or non-places because some of them disappeared completely or they were repurposed after the war. And as a matter of fact, I'm studying now for this book on racism in post-45 Italy. I sort of discovered how they were repurposed for displaced people after the war or for sort of undesirables of one kind or another. So, and they were still, some of them were still functioning. They were still open until the early 60s. There were all sorts of people still in this very precarious, living very precarious lives in these camps. So he began to study these camps in the 80s and publishing in 1987 a book on Ferramonti, which is the largest internment camp established by fascism in Calabria in 1940. In almost 20 years of meticulous research in many different archives, both in Italy and in former Yugoslavia, he mapped and detailed the 70 concentration camps created by the regime between 1940 and 1943. When it came out in 2004, Mussolini's Camps was the first book to provide a full overview of these institutions, because before only sort of very small studies, specific studies had been done. And so he provided, details about the working of the bureaucratic machine, the location of the camps, their typology and functions, as well as their victims, the various categories of people that the regime considered undesirable, and that it wanted to control, to segregate from the rest of the population, and even to expel when it deemed necessary. These undesirables were foreigners originating from enemy's countries, foreign Jews, including those from non-enemy countries, and those who had acquired Italian citizenship since after 1919, and that the racial laws of 1938 deprived of citizenship. But also Italians who were considered politically dangerous. Of course, there were some Italian Jews among them, along with those Italians who were considered allogenous, so minorities living in borderlands on the eastern border. So who were considered somehow not really Italian. So Italians of Slavic background, and civilians also from their next territories in Yugoslavia. So these were the main categories of people interned in a variety of camps, some under the administration of the Ministry of Interior, others established by the army. So all these people, all of a sudden arbitrarily found themselves obliged to live in these segregated spaces in a kind of suspended time, not knowing what would happen to them, many without any protection, especially those who did not have or were deprived of Italian citizenship. And so many living in very poor conditions, several dying, especially in those in the camps established in their next territories from Yugoslavia. They were living in extremely poor conditions, and many of them died of malnutrition and respiratory diseases. So why were these camps forgotten for so long? There are certainly many reasons that Professor Capogreco discusses in the introduction that we may want to discuss later. But one must have something to do with the fact that these camps interned lots of people who were foreigners in the eyes of the Italians, as well as Italians who had been de facto denationalized or de jure denationalized, so either by the racial laws or by the regime intolerance and persecution of whoever expressed even a minor act of dissent. So, and actually, an important point that the book that Capogreco makes in this book is that the colonie di confino, the confinement colonies established in the 1920s and 30s, were already a type of concentration camp. So our thinking about concentration camps has been strongly shaped by the case of the German camps, of course. But as Capogreco reminds us, a concentration camp does not have to take that form. It is a space, and I'm quoting, a space designed to gather civilians who have been segregated following an administrative decisions, and that they are placed under surveillance. This decision is taken by a state without any possibility of recourse. They were first established during colonial wars, as it's been said, and became ordinary practice during the world wars. And just think about, of course, one can make the case and discuss the case of the Japanese Americans in World War II, gathered again in camps as if they were automatically enemies. The international historiography on concentration and internment camps has grown in recent years, showing how they have proliferated with modernity. Concentration camps are not so a thing of the past. They are still with us, and not only in dictatorial regimes, in one form or another. If we look, I would like also to mention, however, how this book has stimulated not only studies of, many studies of aspects of, let's say, what has been called by some historians the universe of concentration camps, or the concentrated modernity. It has stimulated, so if we look at the updated bibliography, the book in the translation as added, we see that the book again has stimulated a lot of research. So the literature has increased after that. So, I hope that we can discuss also whether, the extent to which this book has generated, has created, has contributed to create, let's say, a new memory, much different from, and fill those memory holes in Italian collective memory. So, and hopefully the translation of this book will not only expand our understanding of the working of Italian fascism in the English-speaking world, but also add to our understanding of how modern states, both liberal and dictatorial, deal, both liberal or allegedly liberal and dictatorial, deal with those that they deem undesirable in their midst. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silvana, and let me welcome Carlo Spartaco Capogreco. Professor Capogreco will speak in Italian, and you can see the text translated into English behind him. And while the discussion will continue in English later. Thank you.
Buonasera, anzitutto grazie per questo invito e per la sincera disponibilità degli amici del Centro Primo Levi, della New York University e della Casa Italiana. In particolare ringrazio Natalia Indrimi, Alessandro Cassini, il direttore dell'Istituto di Cultura Paolo Barlera, il console d'Italia Francesco Genuardi e il dottor Stefano Albertini, direttore della Casa. E sono grato anche per la presenza degli illustri colleghi seduti tra un attimo vicini a me, qui su questo palco, Silvana Patriarca, che ha introdotto Mary Gibson e Rudolf Mrazek. Come sappiamo, come è stato detto, la memoria dell'internamento fascista e dei suoi campi di concentramento, quei campi cioè che operarono negli anni di guerra 1940, esattamente dal giugno del 1940 al settembre del 1943, prima ancora cioè dell'occupazione nazista, della nascita della Repubblica di Salò e della estensione alla penisola della Shoah. Questa memoria, dicevo, ha avuto e in parte ancora ha notevoli difficoltà ad affermarsi, soprattutto perché dopo il 1945 in Italia si era diffusa l'idea che i campi di concentramento, ricondotti tutti quanti al sito archetipo del lager, fossero da considerarsi un fenomeno di per sé esclusivamente tedesco. In Italia la storia dei campi di concentramento fascisti non ha perciò trovato spazio nella memoria collettiva e neppure nella coscienza civile. Tale argomento, poco congeniale alla narrazione del passato che si è affermata nel dopoguerra in Italia, rimase generalmente avulso dal sentire comune e dall'interesse della ricerca storiografica. Resta esemplare, io lo cito spesso, l'episodio occorso nel 1965 a Treviso, ad una delegazione slovena giunta per rendere omaggio ai propri connazionali internati e deceduti nel campo, che aveva funzionato alla periferia della città, di quella città del Veneto, che erano stati circa 200 vittime e 200 morti, tra cui 53 bambini. Le autorità locali in quell'occasione non seppero dire alcunché ai familiari che sono giunti dalla Slovenia. Ed erano sinceri perché non avevano mai saputo nulla dell'esistenza di un campo fascista nella loro città. Un episodio questo che conferma inequivocabilmente il fatto che nella giovane Repubblica, come si suol dire, nata dalla Resistenza, potesse accadere che persino in una città che era stata sede essa stessa di un campo di concentramento, né la scuola né le istituzioni avessero fornito alla collettività alcuno input sull'argomento di cui stiamo parlando. La mappatura dei campi, quindi, e la ricostruzione storica di quel sistema, il sistema concentrazionario, potremmo dire fascista, di cui i campi facevano parte, richiesero tempi molto lunghi, anche perché tra la rimozione istituzionale da una parte, la latitanza, tra virgolette, la latitanza degli storici si è detto molto, dall'altra, a farsi carico del grosso delle ricerche che sono state compiute principalmente nel periodo 1984-2004, non furono nella maggior parte dei casi soggetti istituzionalmente deputati a fare storia, non furono degli storici di professione, ma dei giovani ricercatori che, come nel mio caso, operavano per pura passione personale e, oltre a fare ricerca, dovevano spesso lottare contro incomprensioni e distorsioni. Molto potrei raccontare sui tanti anni di ricerca, sulle innumerevoli persone incontrate e sulle difficoltà che spesso ho avuto nel localizzare, nel mappare proprio geograficamente sul territorio i campi per quella che è stata nel 2004, quando uscì questo libro in italiano, la prima mappatura. Come ha scritto Michele Sarfatti, i campi del duce, l'uscita dei campi, il lavoro fatto per i campi del duce è stato anche una sorta di itinerario di scoperta e di indagine e di denuncia che ha portato alla luce appunto una sorta di mappa archeologica, quasi una moderna di scavo di una moderna archeologia, e che può essere anche il libro, può servire anche per chi volesse poi fare insieme ad esso un viaggio della memoria sul territorio. Per tutti gli Stati, come è noto, scopo del provvedimento di internamento dei civili, che tradizionalmente è legato alle contingenze belliche, era originariamente quello di isolare e controllare gli stranieri nemici presenti sul proprio territorio, per evitare che mettessero in atto sabotaggi ed azioni di spionaggio o che ritornassero nella loro patria per arruolarsi nell'esercito durante la guerra, ovviamente. Germania, Polonia, Francia e Gran Bretagna, i paesi che per primi entrarono nella Seconda Guerra Mondiale, fin dal 1939 avevano cominciato ad internare i civili stranieri e in mancanza di uno specifico accordo internazionale il trattamento solitamente offerto ai civili internati veniva fatto sulla falsariga della Convenzione di Ginevra per i prigionieri di guerra. Nel 1929, infatti, ricordiamo, la conferenza diplomatica che ratificò la Convenzione sulla prigionia di guerra aveva annunciato la volontà di stipulare quanto prima, dopo i disastri sui civili della Prima Guerra Mondiale, una convenzione internazionale anche per la protezione dei civili di nazionalità nemica che si sarebbero potuti trovare sul territorio di uno Stato belligerante o su un territorio occupato da uno Stato belligerante. L'anno dopo, siamo nel 1930, a Bruxelles fu costituito il comitato incaricato di elaborare quel progetto. Uno studio noto appunto come progetto di Tokyo, perché fu presentato alla 15ª conferenza internazionale della Croce Rossa che si tenne nel 1934 nella capitale giapponese e che sarebbe dovuto, questo progetto, essere ratificato a Ginevra nel 1940. È evidente che il sopraggiungere della Seconda Guerra Mondiale ne impedì l'attuazione. L'Italia aveva stabilito da tempo delle norme sui sudditi nemici da internare. Successivamente, tra le categorie delle persone passibili dell'internamento che veniva attuato dal Ministero dell'Interno come il confino di polizia, che era una forma pressoché di internamento anteguerra di cui è stato già fatto cenno stasera dalla professoressa Patriarca, il governo ne aggiunse altre 2 di categorie a quelle già precedenti, che erano quelle sostanzialmente tradizionali, soprattutto riguardavano i sudditi nemici. E queste 2 nuove erano quella degli italiani pericolosi, che venivano internati per sospette ragioni di pubblica sicurezza. Veniva detto questo, ma di fatto erano internati per motivi politici, erano dei dissidenti, e quella degli ebrei stranieri. Quest'ultima formula, ebrei stranieri, alquanto ambigua se non la si legge nell'ottica persecutorio-razziale della legislazione antisemita fascista, era una categoria per così dire ibrida. Poneva difatti gli ebrei stranieri a metà strada tra la condizione di nemico e quella di dissidente politico. Equiparando però ai sudditi nemici gli ebrei tedeschi ed ex austriaci, che formalmente, come sappiamo, erano allora cittadini di un paese alleato, Mussolini faceva ora riemergere quell'antico stereotipo antisemita dell'ebreo nemico straniero che alcuni anni dopo sarebbe divenuto centrale nella politica antiebraica della Repubblica fascista di Salò e del suo letale ordine di polizia numero 5 del 30 novembre 1943, che più di ogni altra disposizione avrebbe sdoganato la Shoah nella penisola. Le condizioni materiali di vita registratesi nei campi fascisti erano state delineate dal decreto del duce del 4 settembre 1940, quindi a cose già iniziate, ed erano sostanzialmente coerenti con la normativa umanitaria prevista dalla Convenzione del 1929 per la prigionia di guerra. Nonostante i notevolissimi disagi legati specialmente alla scarsità di cibo e servizi igienici, le condizioni di vita furono sopportabili per i più, specialmente se rapportate a quelle vigenti nei campi italiani dell'internamento, cosiddetto internamento parallelo, che fu quello aperto, sviluppatosi nei campi aperti in seguito all'occupazione della Jugoslavia nell'aprile del 1941, campi che furono posti sotto la gestione militare, pur riguardando i civili, nei quali gli indici di mortalità tra gli internati civili slavi, dovuti a fame e stenti, furono davvero indici raccapriccianti. L'internamento gestito dal Ministero dell'Interno, invece, non corrispondeva propriamente ad una prigionia ed era improntato alle esperienze repressive contentive rivolte soprattutto al brigantaggio ed alla dissidenza politica che il fascismo aveva ereditato dall'Italia liberale e che poi aveva in qualche modo perfezionato per conto proprio. Per capire l'internamento fascista è quindi opportuno, per così dire, guardare più a Ventotene che non ad Auschwitz. Va colto il forte nesso che avevano quei campi col confino di polizia, il modello repressivo concentrazionario autarchico, la cui introduzione nel 1926 rappresentò per l'Italia un passaggio chiave nell'instaurazione della dittatura e nella distruzione dello Stato di diritto. E come il confino, attuato nelle piccole isole, le cosiddette colonie di confino, l'internamento consentiva spesso agli internati di intraprendere iniziative autogestite che indubbiamente miglioravano la propria condizione materiale e spirituale. Che si svolgessero comunque nei campi o nei comuni di internamento libero, l'internamento infatti aveva come il confine una seconda opzione, quella di cosiddetto internamento libero, che voleva dire essere sostanzialmente al domicilio coatto. L'internamento attuato dal Ministero dell'Interno, quindi in una delle due tipologie, fino all'estate del 1943, non aveva un legame immediato con la deportazione nei lager. Neppure per gli ebrei stranieri aveva questo legame. Finché l'Italia rimase un paese sovrano, esso non rappresentò quindi un pericolo per la vita degli internati, tanto pure per la vita degli internati ebrei. Il regime mussoliniano, infatti, quantunque ufficialmente razzista e antisemita dal 1938, se non dal 1937, non aveva ancora esplicitato progetti di sterminio e i suoi campi, legati alle contingenze belliche, come si diceva, costituivano piuttosto dei luoghi di contenimento, potremmo dire una sorta di limbo giuridico che, se non per tutte, almeno per alcune categorie di internati, consente un qualche ragionevole confronto con taluni centri di accoglienza o centri di permanenza più o meno temporanei dei nostri giorni, che si trovano in diverse nazioni odierne. Al di là delle possibili similitudini tra le strutture e le possibili divergenze tra i loro nomi, che sono scelti spesso solo in ragione di esigenze eufemistiche o retoriche dei governi che aprono i campi, il confronto anche antropologico tra le realtà contentive del passato e quelle attuali ci aiuta indubbiamente molto, aiuta a riflettere sulle condizioni, sulla condizione di internati, di rifugiati, di apolidi e più in generale sulla questione dei diritti umani e sulla matrice storica dei vari campi. In quelli, per esempio, del sistema di accoglienza italiano per migranti, quelli che sono stati aperti nel 2008 e che vengono denominati con la sigla, con l'acronimo di CAR, centri di accoglienza per i richiedenti asilo, in questi, ad esempio, si possono cogliere, a saperli leggere, almeno 3 elementi che ricordano da vicino l'internamento fascista degli ebrei degli anni 40. La localizzazione delle strutture in zone povere del meridione, l'elargizione di un misero sussidio ai più indigenti, il ruolo delle strutture che erano destinate allora come oggi a trattenere degli stranieri in attesa di una possibile espulsione o di un possibile punto di approdo di un visto o della disponibilità di uno Stato. Oggi finalmente la storia e la memoria dei campi fascisti si sono quasi del tutto aperte al sentire comune ed al riconoscimento accademico ed istituzionale. Ma questa memoria ritrovata non è una memoria facile come potrebbe sembrare, perché si presta facilmente a narrazioni trite e a letture approssimative, se non mitologiche. In particolare il peso di Auschwitz ha portato molti nello scoprire i campi italiani, da un lato ad immaginare che essi abbiano avuto un nesso assoluto con la legislazione anti-ebraica, quando poi di fatto le categorie degli ebrei, sia italiani sia stranieri, in questi campi erano come percentuale anche di persone del tutto marginali. Dall'altro a sottolineare di questi campi i meriti, cioè ciò che i campi di Mussolini non sono stato, non tanto quello che sono stati, ma quello che non sono stato rispetto a quello ai campi nazisti. Al momento della pubblicazione, della traduzione di queste mie parole, abbiamo ancora molto lavorato di fronte, insieme anche con gli amici del Centro Primo Levi, oltre che con i traduttori del mio libro, per capire le intrinseche specificità e la storia di queste strutture. Va detto purtroppo che la legge italiana del 20 luglio del 2000, la numero 211, la legge che 20 anni fa ha proclamato il 27 gennaio giorno della memoria, non ha sempre favorito il confronto critico degli italiani con la storia dei loro campi e di altri nodi cruciali della storia nazionale. Nonostante abbia certo aiutato ad integrare nel dibattito culturale la storia della persecuzione anti-ebraica, non è esente quella legge da inclinazioni celebrative tipiche della memorializzazione pubblica, peraltro. Sono soventi i casi in cui facilita l'elisione delle responsabilità italiane per rilanciare l'immagine stereotipata della bontà italiana, della bontà nazionale, anziché problematizzarla e favorire l'inquadramento storico dei fatti. Emblematica di questo fenomeno è la narrazione che trasforma spesso la storia di Ferramonti, di Campagna o di altri campi, di questi 48, della rete dei 48 campi del duce che si trovavano nel mezzogiorno d'Italia, quasi in luoghi di salvezza intenzionalmente resa possibile dai civili o dai militari o dalla polizia italiana. In realtà la sopravvivenza degli ebrei nei campi meridionali, la loro mancata deportazione verso Auschwitz fu primariamente una questione di geografia e di geopolitica, poiché gli alleati li liberarono prima che iniziassero le deportazioni. La narrazione quindi apologetica e spesso fantasiosa, che è fiorita anche col contributo dei sopravvissuti, che non sempre hanno la capacità di distinguere tra il fascismo repubblicano e quello monarchico e di contestualizzare le loro vicende, è molto diversa, ha poco in comune quella narrazione fantasiosa con l'immagine che lo storico legge attraverso i copiosi documenti lasciati dai governi eppure dagli internati stessi, documenti dell'epoca. Eppure all'interno di questo divario continua a scorrere ancora la mistica del vero campo italiano, oppure del cosiddetto campo all'italiana. Spero perciò in conclusione che la pubblicazione in lingua inglese di questo mio libro, apripista per così dire, possa contribuire ulteriormente a fornire delle chiavi di lettura dei campi di concentramento e dell'internamento civile e soprattutto possa riportarli nella storia, sottraendo alle letture semplicistiche o banalizzanti le loro vicende, oppure ad un inquadramento, se si può dire, ebraico-centrico o olocausto-centrico, in una storia che è molto più complessa. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Professor Capogreco. I'd like to invite Mary Gibson to comment on the book. Please welcome Mary Gibson.
Hey, good evening. As with everyone else, I want to thank Natalia and Dirimi because for inviting me here to be on a panel which you'll see relates in a maybe different way than one might think to my own research. So I want to thank the Primo Levi Center, the NYU Casa Italiana, Stefano Albertini, and of course the Italian Consulate for organizing these various events for the Giorno della Memoria. And it's a real pleasure to meet Professor Capogreco. I've admired his work for a long time, and so we meet in New York, not in Italy, but in New York. There are many reasons, and I'll only name a few before I get to some of my main remarks, and some of them were already mentioned by Silvana. Patriarca, why it's so important that this book, I campi del duce, has been translated into English. There's just, I would say, please buy the book. There's meticulous research into at least 70 camps based on a large variety of sources. And if you're an Italian historian, it's incredibly impressive because it's not just the variety of sources, but within the archives, the different series of archival documents. And anyone who's worked in those kind of documents know how much energy, time, and usually digging it takes to find this kind of material. And when you read the book, you will see that, as in Nazi Germany and its occupied territories, camps blanketed the country. And this is something that I'm not an expert in the history of the Holocaust or even of fascism, but I think is relatively new, that I certainly have taught the history of fascism and World War II for a long time, and we knew about major camps, but now there is so much research in country after country about all of the smaller camps, that they were everywhere. You know, this idea that no one can know about them is fairly impossible. I had a postdoc in Vienna a few years ago. I went to Madhouse, and I thought, I've gone to the camp. I've seen it. It's very well done, I think. Looks like it's been the exhibit's been organized by historians, but I had no idea that then there were at least 40, 50 other locations of forced labor or some kind of camp in Austria. So this is a phenomenon which this book brings out in terms of Italy. You see the map, you see where the camps were, and I think it will be a surprise to almost everyone. And there's an invaluable, I could say, appendix, but it's really a huge chapter with micro-histories of almost all of the camps, what they'd been before, when they were founded, who was in them, what the conditions were, what happened to them afterwards, statistics where possible. So it's just an incredibly invaluable research source for historians. And as I'll say in a minute, there's certain, at first I looked and I thought this is too much, but I started reading, picking out certain places that I was interested in, and you start seeing threads that go through the details in this appendix, which really help give a kind of concrete sense of the bigger generalizations. Now, my particular perspective is from the histories of prisons in general, and prisons going back to the 19th century. My recent book is on Italian prison history from unification to World War I. And so this is really the way I read the book. I don't know how many people know anything about prison history, but I'm sure a lot of you know about Michel Foucault, who wrote a very famous book in 1975, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. So prison historians really still, no matter what country they're writing about, begin with Michel Foucault and his what then seemed to be astounding revelation about the transition. He would, I think, have said worldwide, but now we see it's much more complicated, from the use of corporal punishment to confinement within what were termed in the 19th century modern penitentiaries. And so there's been a lot of debate about when this happened, this transition, why it happened, what were the reform philosophies, and what the purpose, which was really modernization. I mean, of course, now there are and should be many criticisms of prisons, but there was a kind of idealistic sense that at least prisoners should be treated with private cells, with good food, with fresh air and water, with labor which was not forced and backbreaking. And of course, if you know Foucault, he thinks that this kind of reform philosophy was just a cover for a kind of mental and psychological chaining of people, which replaced physical chaining. But I thought of this often when reading the book and looking at the appendices, where we see that not even these kind of ideals of the 19th century are in any way take place in the fascist camps. So I would like to talk about three aspects of Professor Capogreco's work that relates to this larger, this broader historiographical discussion about prisons, and I think shows how his book is important not only to Italian history, to the history of fascism, to the history of the Holocaust and the Shoah, but also to the history of confinement in a kind of broad sense. And of course, this is a very immediate political issue, both in the United States, where we have mass incarceration, and in Italy, where there's overcrowding, and there's, of course, the new, what Professor Capogreco just mentioned, the immigration camps, and the attempt to try to think in a kind of broader terms about how to categorize, think about, and in many ways ultimately get rid of this type of confinement. Okay, the first point I'd like to make is that this book emphasizes the continuing importance of penal colonies in the modern history of punishment. Of course, we all know about Nazi concentration camps and maybe think about it as a 20th century phenomenon, but if you look at prison history, in fact, the modern penitentiary, the kind of indoor, at least clean, healthy kind of prison that is the ideal in the 19th century and today, was supposed to replace and wipe out corporal punishment, gallery slavery, and other kinds of camps that had characterized the early modern world. And if you look back through the 19th and through the 20th century, of course, camps never died out. If you read kind of Foucaultian prison history, it looks like prisons, for all their faults, replace these kind of old, dirty, unorganized, almost illegal kinds of outdoor camps for punishment. And in fact, they continued in Italy. There were what were called bagni, or forced labor camps, which replaced galley service, which existed until 1889, the Zanardelli Penal Code, where prisoners worked in chains outdoors. Domicilio coatto, which was mentioned by Professor Capogreco, which were police camps on the islands, and agricultural colonies for adult men, which were, in theory, to help reform, but the few studies that have been done have shown they were often very little different from the old Bani or the forced labor camps. So that you can see a kind of thread going from kind of the old regime and gallery rowing and gallery slavery through the 19th century. But as this book points out, then there's an explosion of the reuse of camps during World War I, and then increasing through the interwar period and World War II. And there's a kind of transition with World War I think even more generally, in terms of camps we find in Europe. And of course, we can't forget the colonies. While the kind of outdoor forced labor was declining in Europe, it was often being deported, transferred to the colonies. But the camps, or people who were interned in kind of outdoor conditions, the categories change from common to political crime. We see it in the camps, at least in theory. We have people kept because they are somehow thought to be or labeled as dangerous to the state, rather than camps being part of a regular judicial system. They're part of a kind of extra-legal, often what's called administrative, kind of bureaucracy. The earlier camps are mostly for men and boys. We see in these camps, and again, if you read the micro-histories, that very many of them had women and children in them. And the categorization of who was most likely to be interned changed from class, mostly lower-class men in the 18th and 19th century, to certain supposed races, Jews, Slavs, Roma, Sinti, Africans, etc. Okay, so this is one of the first points I think the book helps us see and clarify in terms of prison history. The penal colonies are shrinking in importance, but then they explode after World War I, and we see the Italian specifics. Secondly, I think the book helps us question whether we can see in fascist Italy, and this needs a lot more research, any kind of distinction between what might be considered the normal, traditional criminal justice system of courts, police, and penitentiaries, supposedly modern penitentiaries. And the fascists were very proud of their prison system. They put out huge coffee table books extolling how good the prison system was. And this kind of irregular, extrajudicial system of camps. And I think that certainly traditionally in German historiography, and there isn't much research in Italy, but I would also say the little bit of Italian historiography, it was assumed that somehow the normal system continued, a kind of honorable way that most people who were involved in the criminal justice system were not really touched by fascism or Nazism. And these other camps were somehow run by the fascists, the Nazis, on another track. Well, a very important book by Nicholas Watzmann on Germany has shown that there was, in fact, incredible complicity and cooperation between the two systems. I think this book certainly shows that occurs after 1914. It's a very slippery differentiation between what's criminal, semi-criminal, criminalized in terms of populations interned. I expect it goes back earlier during the fascist era. Okay, the third issue that I think the book illuminates, again in relation to prison history, is the conditions of life itself. This is something that often prison historians, or I think historians of concentration camps, less so now, but traditionally ignored. It's hard to get to, it's hard to find the sources. In the 19th, early 20th century, most prisoners are illiterate. They don't leave memoirs. They don't leave any kind of traces. But you can see that Professor Capogreco really, this took incredible amount of research for camp after camp after camp to not only describe the traditions, but compare them in what might seem to be a very minute way, but I think it's incredibly important both as history and maybe even politically. He, for instance, shows, and some of this has been mentioned, differences between northern and southern camps, often the camps which confined Slavs had the worst conditions. They were up near the front. They were run by the military. They were what he calls a kind of parallel system. Foreigners, in some cases, got better treatment if they were considered to be covered by the Geneva Agreement, as opposed to Italians, whose camps were often hidden from inspection by international organizations. Although it is interesting, and he uses very effectively inspection reports from the Red Cross, Swiss delegation, the Catholic Church, rabbis. There were some camps which were inspected. I don't know how much they were cleaned up before the inspections, but it gives, if you read against the grain, this book gives you, can pull out details about everyday lives. What was the food like? What were the sleeping conditions? Prisoners, in theory, got subsidies. Could they buy enough food? Did they work? Which could, in fact, be good, as opposed to forced labor, you made a little extra money. And to me, a kind of amazing characteristic, there was a role of private entrepreneurs. Again, if you read these micro-histories, you see, for instance, this guy, Eugenio Perini, who sets up, runs, and profits from camps at Pistici, Fardfa, Castel di Guido, at least. I may have missed some. So there's this kind of not just blurring of lines between criminal, non-criminal, foreign, non-foreign, military, police, but also between public, private, and there's profiteering, which of course is a real political problem in these camps. So he's been very innovative in using his sources, using the inspection reports, and as we've mentioned, ironically, the fact that most of the camps with Jews were in the South, partially probably to keep them from inspection, saved many of their inhabitants because the occupation did not go down that far and they were freed earlier. A Foucaultian framework would really condemn all places of confinement, which is, I think, a good perspective. I don't think we can think of a prison again after reading his book as anywhere that's benevolent. All is disciplinary hells, but I think it is incredibly important to make these distinctions: who ran what were the conditions, who was in them, what was better and worse, who was better off, who wasn't, partially just for the record, so that we have the truth, if I dare use that word, today. But also in terms of thinking about people who are in camps now, that even if the camp is, what can be done to improve their lives? I mean, how were injustices, how were euphemisms used and injustices imposed on these camps during fascism that might help us see at least partial remedies for the suffering that immigrants or other groups now have in modern camps. So I'll conclude. I'm sorry if I've gone on a little too long, by mentioning memory. Again, the maps, the traces, the ruins of these camps is something I think that's very powerful in the book. And I think this is true of all institutions of confinement. My book has examples from 19th century prisons in Rome. Only one was in any sense a camp, but they're in buildings that even Romans don't have any idea, had been an institution of incarceration. So I think it's interesting and important to revive this and remember this. As I looked through the back, I looked for camps that seemed of most interest to me, the ones that had been camps of domicilio coato, which then became camps of confino, and then sometimes became concentration camps, or in fact were half and half. So after let's say a political opponent, a homosexual, a prostitute, had been finished their sentence of confino, they could just be conveniently flipped over into a concentration camp where there was no legal limit to how long that person could be held. And this might seem a little frivolous, but, kind of takes you back to realize, for instance, that there was one at Fordham, where I have bought and still have in my study the most beautiful handmade curtains, these towns that you've gone to as a kind of, or I have, as a kind of innocent and ignorant tourist. I mean, I'm a researcher, but tourist, and there was a camp. Aberdobello and Puglia, there's a camp. I mean, it's just the infinite number of names as you read through this list where there was a camp, and this is something that Professor Capogreco has discovered, has mapped, has given us the details, and is absolutely astounding. So I think I'll finish here. I just want to thank him for this book. I think it helps us, alerts us to the danger of any kind of confinement under whatever rubric, usually false rubric, it is labeled as, and educates us to identify the dangers and think of them in a historical context. So thank you.
Thank you for this very thoughtful comment, and please welcome Professor Rudolf Mrazek, who will continue the evening. Please welcome Professor.
I will be short because time is, when you plan to finish this, because I would like to hear audience. No escape. I will be idiosyncratic and naive because I was very much touched by this book. You may think what I am doing here because I know nothing about Italy. I work on Indonesia, of all places. And 3 days ago, my book on concentration camps in Indonesia and in Theresienstadt near Prague was published. One book about these two very different camps. So what I can tell to Spartaco, right? It's I was taught through my practice that when I'm writing, when I'm teaching, I'm actually looking for a friend. And in reading Spartaco's book, I got some friendly winks or friendly smile, friendly moments. I think the most important moment was that the burden of his study, the burden of his book is in present. It's in how we think about the camps and how we today are interpreting the camps. If you read the book, and it's the way how I think you will read the book also, you are suddenly, you go, it's going on, you turn the pages, and suddenly name appears. And the name is, for instance, Auschwitz, or it's Perugia, or it's Florence, or it's Lampedusa, right? And suddenly you feel that actually the structure of the book, the network of the book, is about the past that flowing into the present. I actually recalled a moment when I was in Jerusalem, and a friend came to me in the morning, an Israeli journalist, and he cried. And I said, "What's happened, Yizar?" And he said, "They are putting Afghans to Dachau." You know, that kind of moment, surprising, is like shocking. You realize that history is one thing, and if history is really concentrated somewhere, it's in concentration camps. And this is how you know the Spartaco's book is influencing me. He talked about memory as forgetting, which is you know it is about that. It's one thing. Memory is forgetting. But still, suddenly it comes to you and it's clear, and he documented it in very, very dry way, very simple way. There is not much emotion. But suddenly you know that memory is forgetting. He has memory. There are wonderful short, I would not say stories, there are shocks about Red Cross acting in the Italian camps. And it's our pragmatic memory. You should be reasonable. So the Red Cross was invited to some camps. If they would not later report, it's okay, the camp is going on, they would not be invited again. So it was the only thing what to do. And this is our pragmatic memory today. We actually think about the camps that way. You should be reasonable, right? You could not say they were put people in the camps, they are asking us questions we are not able to answer. They were not able to answer. We still are not able to answer. To say we understand camps is just your consciousness is silent at the moment. So, and there is another memory he is mentioning. It's a memory. I would say it's a TV memory, and he mentioned it again. I think it's just one or two places. Then he mentions Schindler, and he mentions how we make a narrative of camps, and they always end either in such a tragedy like they died and it's sad and we go for dinner, right, because we read the narrative, or that some good Schindler comes out and there is a solution. We cannot accept there is no solution, and I think his book is like that. There is no solution. There is not one place in the book that he is saying it's like that. Now we rationally understand that. Now, it may be the way his method is working on me. Frankly, when I read it first time, I thought it's a somebody called it, I think, called it like appendix and the book. I think it's rather introductory part and the main part of the book. And it's many stories. There is name of the camp, and there is like basic information about the camp. Name of the camp and information about the camp. Frankly, it's repetitive. I would even say at times it is boring. But you get into, if you read it, you get into that also hypnotic stage of feeling that time is just repeating itself, that there is no high point, no low point. It's no liberation, it's no putting in the camp. He actually doesn't write very much how people were arrested. You know that most dramatic places you read in Holocaust studies, how people were arrested, how they died, or how they were liberated. It's just going on in monotonous way. But then you realize maybe that hypnotic state you are there as a reader is most close to the way people in the camps were feeling. Day after day, night after night, nothing was happening. Time was going. There were roll calls, of course. There was some systemization of time. But time was going like that. Maybe it's for historian a method how to get to the feeling of the people of the camp. And what historian can do otherwise than to get as close as can. It never gets to them, right? It always gets like that. So the way I actually am ignorant in the history of Italy. My wife is a historian of Italy. I am going sometimes to Florence, Montepulciano, whatever she's writing on Piero Calamandrei, and I'm doing spouse, so I'm just tourist at it. Perfect profession, right? If I am retired. And but maybe that I am so ignorant in Italy made the book so fascinating for me, because I told you my book was published 3 days ago, and I am still living in that Theresienstadt Nazi concentration camp. And suddenly I got something which is cosmically different. It's cosmically different. And at the same time, that Foucault was mentioned, that uncanny, this is the way the postmodern scholars today like to say, uncanny, uncanny way. It's the same. So it's cosmically different, Italian camps to Nazi camp, but they are the same. They are like the fact that there is that beauty of landscape, the name of the camps, Perugia, Puglia, Florence, you had to feel like a tourist. And his second part of the book really read a little bit like, excuse me, but a little bit like when you are looking for a hotel in Italy, So they have, it's 200 meters for a church and 100 meters from the beach. And you have reviews of readers, it's good, it's less good, it's worse good. So there is that kind of beauty that you cannot get against the Prussian, really dry, systematic kind of the camps were basically doing. That somebody said standard camps. This is, there is a clean water, I will just answer. Yes. So this kind of cosmical distance and resemblance on make you think about what that kind of universality of the camps is doing. The concentration universe, Spartaco mentions, right? The notion that there is more than archipelago, that there is a universe, that there is connection by trains. In Nazi camps, it seems to be normal that railways, this is the most modern network of railways that was done in 20th century, that network of trains between the camps. Or the sense of organization of time, like you have the roll calls 5 times a day, it's like Muslim prayer, it's every, or the architecture of the camps. We talked about that before, the barracks. It's only in a few camps in Italy. The symmetry. There is a book by Jan van Pelt, quite old now, 15 years. But he's a Dutch Jew, and he has that family like every Jew in Europe had, the annihilation of his relatives. And he wrote a book about the beautiful Auschwitz. That horror of that thing he feels, because when you look, he found a plans of Auschwitz in Moscow archives, and he found that really beautiful symmetrical kind of organization of barracks, and he says, I cannot stop thinking. It's very beautiful. And then you have Italy, then you have tents, and you have castles, and you have villas. And you have also barracks. So you are thinking, is that slippery slope from the camps in Italy to the Nazi camps? Is it really the development? Is it really so gloomy? And I call it in my book concentrated modernity. Is it really concentrated modernity that putting people somewhere, enslaving them, and trying to make it the most efficient way? The most modern way. When I go through Manhattan yesterday, I was actually thinking, it's very camp-like doing like that, and these people are going where they have to go. They cannot escape it, right? So you think, is that so gloomy? And I'm very much under impression my book about Theresienstadt, that it really looks like gloomy postmodern apocalyptic world, perfectly organized, everybody victim of something. So you think, is there any hope? I was last 5 months in Amsterdam, and I had a friend who worked on Greece, and she was in Greek camps recently, and she came back, and she was that Afghan, the immigrants came in Greece on the islands, and she was terribly gloomy and terribly depressed. She said, there is no hope. And I was thinking about that when I said Spartaco's book, that there is a hope. There is a hope in absence of physical resistance. There is no physical resistance possible, but there are always partisans mentioned suddenly, or there is mentioning that somebody rejected to do Roman salute. There is that sense of dignity that is always existing. And it's again like Drox in that book. He is never saying there is a resistance, it's not slippery slope, the progress is different. It's going against that complete systematization of camps. It's just peace suddenly like flesh in his writing, but it is there much more than if he will do some very optimistic conclusion. I would say at the last thing, conclusion, I just met Spartaco for the first time just before we met here, and I was thinking that kind of repetitive, monotonous description of that mini histories, description that tourist guide through the camps, that there is some level before which make it very touching. It's not just description of how many people, and if there was some hunger, if there was less hunger, some torture, there is something beneath. And I asked him how he got into that working on the camps. And his first sentence was, I am a doctor, I am a pediatric doctor. And he came to the camp, first camp of his life, not as a historian, not as a Capogreco, but as a doctor, and he saw that there is nothing in the camp. And suddenly he realized that the camps is some phenomenon. It was the phenomenon, not some memorial museum in New York or something like that. It was that emptiness of that. And actually his mini histories are his passing through the camps. I don't know if it was mentioned here, but he was going practically through all the camps, and there was nothing. And he was going through that. And this is the substratum of his thinking and substratum of his very dry history writing. So, idiosyncratic and naive. I'm finished.
I'd like to invite Professor Capogreco and Professor Gibson. Spartaco. Mary, you want to come up? Silvana, do you want to come up? Why not? And I'd like to thank everybody for the very thoughtful remarks. There are a few things that I think is worth saying, adding. It was said that Capogreco sparked new studies, and there are two lines that I think are quite prominent and quite important. And one are young scholars who are studying the profiteer in the economics of the camps. Something that few people know, camps were in fact rented by the Italian government from private owners, the church that rented out a number of buildings for this purpose, and created quite a large circulation of money, and that's something that is a big problem today, and something that is important to reflect upon. Another type of detention and segregation that was not mentioned is in mental health institutions. This is is not studied very much. But we know of political detainees from Libya and from Ferramonti who were sent to mental hospitals in the south of Italy and most likely killed. Let's say they died there very quickly. And the last thing that perhaps is also worth, we mentioned like a comparison between Italian and German camps. Germany had a very large amount of concentration camps that were not death camps. Death camps are a handful, very few are the exception. What the rule was in Europe were the concentration camps. So, and now I think we open the floor to questions for our speakers. Thank you.
I don't have a question. I just want to commend Professor Capogreco for what he did. He started this research 30, 40 years ago, I don't know when nobody cared about this topic. It was not important to anybody. And he has to be really praised for what has done all these years in obscurity.
Thank you, Donato. This comment was from Donato Grosser, whose father, Bert Grosser, was in Ferramonti and was also one of the main activists of della during the war.
Very quick question. Why didn't the Jews get deported before 1943?
Chiedevo si risponde alle singole domande oppure facciamo un giro? Devo rispondere prima. Sì, puoi rispondere prima. Cioè. No, l'altro era un commento a lei. Ok. La domanda è perché non sono stati La questione non era all'ordine del giorno. Prima del 1943 non c'era la Shoah in Italia. La Shoah è arrivata nelle singole nazioni europee, quando è arrivata quasi sempre nazioni occupate o comunque nazioni collaborazioniste, eccetera. In Italia la Shoah ha fatto ingresso dopo l'armistizio, quindi quando diciamo 43 noi vogliamo dire dopo il settembre 43, come pure quando noi diciamo campi fascisti, in effetti anche questo un po' sbagliato, perché questa struttura di questa rete di campi rimane sostanzialmente funzionante anche durante il governo Badoglio.
So the Shoah arrived in Italy after So the Shoah arrives in Italy after the arrival of the Nazis. So it was not. So the deportation was not, a matter considered by the fascists before the arrival of the Nazis. As soon as the Nazis arrived, of course, they organized deportations, and the fascists collaborated with them. So the camps that we're talking about here in the book are the camps created when the fascist government was sovereign, and they still existed under Badoglio, who is the prime minister who replaced Mussolini after July 25. And he was in charge, but he did not close the camps, and so he also bore responsibilities for what happened afterwards.
Thank you. Did the Italian government ever pay reparations to the people that were in the camps, in a way acknowledging the fact that the camps existed?
Allora, il governo italiano non ha, sappiamo che l'Italia non ha avuto, diciamo, non c'è stata neanche una memoria giudiziaria, non solo non c'è stata la memoria comune, la memoria storiografica di cui abbiamo parlato prima, non c'è stata una memoria giudiziaria perché non ci sono stati i processi ai criminali di guerra, che pure c'erano. Naturalmente non sto parlando solo di questi campi, che erano tutto sommato quelli del Ministero dell'Interno, erano i più, tra virgolette, innocui, no? Da questo punto di vista, ma quelli, abbiamo visto nello stesso periodo, i campi per gli slavi, nella Jugoslavia e in Italia, c'erano anche dei crimini di guerra lì.
So, as we know, there were no trials of war crimes in Italy after the war. So, the judicial memory was non-existent at that point. So there was, right? So also these camps, especially, so the crimes that were committed in these camps, especially the ones that were established on the coast of, primarily on the coast of Yugoslavia, were not considered. Vuoi andare avanti?
Is there any evidence that the average Italian knew of the existence of these camps under Mussolini? And would you say that it might have been considered okay or normal to the average Italian?
Allora, diciamo, il tipico italiano, l'italiano medio, sapeva qualcosa di queste cose o pensava che fossero normali? Cosa si può dire?
Naturalmente bisogna guardare anche la struttura fisica per capire bene. Molti di questi campi, che noi chiamiamo tutti campi, come ha detto già la professoressa Gibson prima, ha ricordato questo fatto che non tutti avevano la stessa struttura. Se noi guardiamo per esempio un campo di baracche, c'era una separazione fisica con il paese, la gente, i popolani, diciamo, della zona. In molti casi, lo stesso campo numero 2 per gli internati ebrei, il secondo campo per numero di ebrei di questo periodo era il campo di campagna. Non c'era separazione fisica, quindi la gente sapeva, vedeva.
So the structures were quite different. So there were camps that looked more like, barracks and so physically very identifiable, and there were other camps that were, for example, in villas, right? So they were sort of more within, not too separated and segregated. So that for some it was difficult to understand what was going on. So, and then some of these camps were, in any case, others were repurposed after the war. I'm adding something, repurposed, and others were destroyed, so that, that the memory also was difficult to.
Aggiungo un'altra cosa velocemente, che per capire bene questo, anche per capire se c'è il rapporto con la popolazione, bisogna andare, come dicevo prima nelle parole che ho detto, ritornare al confino, non guardare ai lager nazisti, ma guardare a quello che aveva già fatto il fascismo prima della guerra. Il prototipo c'era e lo stesso costruttore dei campi, Arturo Bocchini, capo della polizia era lo stesso che aveva organizzato il confino di polizia, quindi il modello era quello. E quindi la popolazione nei paesi, perché non era solo campi, era anche internamento, tra virgolette, questo ossimoro, internamento libero, no? La gente era nei paesi al domicilio coatto, quindi in mezzo alla gente sostanzialmente.
Right, so there were forms, the precursors of these camps, of some of these camps were to be found in the colonie di confino, confinement structures that often were not physical structures separated and so on, but there were those who were confinati, sent to confino, were in the middle of small villages, remote villages, and so on. So somehow this made them, sort of already something present that was not so starkly new, right? And so there is also that issue that complicates, I think, the memory from, let's say, from an anthropological point of view. And then, of course, we could mention many other reasons why, at a certain point, the historians after the war did not pick up that issue in particular, but preferred to the priorities of historiography after the war were others, right? So a lot of this, what happened between 40 and 43, was marginalized, right, in the memory, in the collective memory.
So would you say that the average person didn't question what was going on, just like we don't question what's going on in prisons today?
So the average person was not questioning, would you say? Sorry, it's sort of getting late. Okay. So le persone, diciamo, l'italiano medio non si poneva delle domande, non faceva delle domande critiche, come succede oggi anche con questi campi, no? Per i migranti, se pensi ai campi di detenzione dei migranti, c'è una reazione?
L'italiano medio era abituato a vedere questi estranei e ufficialmente non si poteva parlare con loro, ma si parlava, no? Abbiamo il modello classico di Cristo si è fermato a deboli, no? Allora, il problema di questa memoria che è mancata è che appunto il confino aveva radici più lontane, ormai era inserito nel contesto, la popolazione sapeva che esistevano i confinati, erano tutti magari di provenienze diverse, motivi diversi, però c'erano, durante la guerra, già la guerra vuol dire una situazione diversa, una situazione dove la gente stava peggio oppure stava in guerra, ma questi venivano considerati sostanzialmente dei confinati. È uscito un libro nel 2000.
So he's saying again that these people were considered to a large extent some people in confinement. So they didn't seem to be so different, and people were so used to that. So I guess that there was not a reaction, right, against or seeing it as something abnormal in many ways. Right?
Nel libro trovate una mappa dell'Italia con questi 48 campi del Ministero dell'Interno. Quelli per i jugoslavi sono una questione a parte, ma questi 48 campi sono 3 o 4 i campi con le baracche, la tipologia lager, diciamo. Stavo dicendo prima che è uscito un libro nel 2004 insieme al mio, quasi, con lo stesso editore, Einaudi, e si chiamava Lettere dal confino di Leone Ginsburg, Lettere dal confino, ma lui non era confinato, era internato. Ecco, per dire, noi stiamo parlando di libri con una certa serietà, un certo rigore, un editore serio, ma si usava dire confinato per dire che il confino era già conosciuto, aveva una sua storia in Italia.
Right. So there are also in the book Professor Capogreco distinguishes between internati and confinati, and this was a bit of a blurred, rather a blurred distinction at the time in the minds of people, and some people refer. And in the case of this book of letters by Leone Ginsberg, he referred to himself as confinato, but in fact he was internato. So there is a typology that is rather complex and sometimes blurs in the minds of Italians themselves.
Good evening. Grazie mille. This is a very important conversation for our time. Thank you very much for bringing this to us. My wife and I were in Campo de Fasoli last year. It is not on most of the tourist maps, of course, and so to go and see the camp there where Primo Levi was held is a very powerful experience. So thank you very much for bringing this to our attention. We also know this past week or so, the surveys in Italy have talked about how Italians really deny this happened and how anti-Semitism is on the rise in Italy and around the rest of the world. So this is very much a subject for our time. And I cannot help but think, as you all speak about this historic concentration camp, we are still living in a country where children are being confined every day. And so what is the responsibility that we have, you as historians, we as the people listening to you, to respond to what is going on around us at this time? We are told to be bystanders, upstanders, or resistors. So what does the history tell us of what to do, because we are watching this in front of our eyes in this country, not in other countries historically, but today? Thank you.
Would you like, because it's about responsibility, the responsibility of the historian.
I would just very quickly. I think that I'm always speaking hyperbolic like Donald Trump, right? I think historians fail, like in general, and it inspired me for writing my book, which was like out of despair, not from the camps only, but from how history dealt with that. I did some interviews in Israel during past 10 years for my book on Theresienstadt, and I found that many survivors of Theresienstadt, if they really dislike something, if they are despair by something, it's Holocaust studies. That somebody comes and asks them how was it and what we should write about that and so on. It's very difficult. It's not a problem of so much historian profession, but ethics. And I think every historian has to fail in the end to describe it. This is why I stress in this book we talk about today, that kind of hypnotic state he is getting us and getting us closer. It's very difficult to get close because we will never understand what happened in the camps. But we should accept that we can never understand that and just getting a little bit closer and closer.
Oh, I got it. Hi.
No, I just want to, just quickly,
Yeah,
I don't.
I got a question.
And I'll be very quick. I don't know what to say, obviously resist, but I'm not sure how. That's the problem. But I agree that historians will fail. We can never really know what it was like in these camps, but I think it's extremely important to accumulate the kind of detail that Professor Capogreco did, or for, in my case, prisons, to come as close as possible to figure out how people, poor, interned, powerless, what kind of conditions they endured, as opposed to simply looking at, what's the word, regulations or narrative, what's discourses, high discourses. But it's a responsibility to try to figure this out. And I think the more detail, the more detail we have, we can only hope that it might inform policy in some way, not to collapse categories or to use rhetoric, or but I don't know. It's a time when I feel a little hopeless.
Perhaps use the words of a Auschwitz survivor, Roman Kent. 5 years ago, I went to Auschwitz, and he said, "Do not be a bystander." That's what Roman Kent said. I know, but that's a comment from a survivor of Auschwitz. But it doesn't matter. It survived Auschwitz also. But that's what he said. Do not be a bystander.
So I think that now the question was actually about historians and what they can do. And I think that actually they can do a lot because the discussion in the public discussion is very simplified, and historians can actually add depth, and they can add a framework, a larger framework in which people that provide, perspective and can help people to actually do something, because we know that something can be done. We are not living yet in a dictatorial regime, and so people can actually take stand. And as a matter of fact, the work that Spartaco Capogreco is doing with the Fondazione Ferramonti and this kind of work that spread knowledge about these structures and what kind of similarities they have with what we have today, what has been created today to deal with the so-called problem, the so-called crisis of refugee and asylum seekers in Europe. I mean, this kind of work is really enlightening for people, and I think that again we can do something. And there are historians who are activists, and it's not. One thing is sort of, the difficulties of knowing completely something that happened in the past. But on the other hand, history is a continuing investigation, which has in my view, a social responsibility. And I know many historians who actually do what they can to, in a situation that seems to be hopeless, but it's not yet hopeless. Otherwise, we would not be here. I think we still think that doing this kind of work, precise work, is very important to do.
What percentage of Italian Jews survived the war as a result of the Italian people?
The percentage, I can say, it's similar to the percentage of the Jews in France. It's about those who died in the camps, Italian Jews who died in the camps, are about between 20 and 25% of the community, and it's a similar, a bit lower maybe than France, but quite similar.
So we can take one more question, because we are really late, right? Would you like to decide One quick question, right?
I read a lot of history, but I'm not a scholar, so a lot of it is disorganized. Years ago, I heard a story, or I read one, which may be one of those myths about the good Italy that was referred to. But I wonder if anybody could, I've asked this question a couple of times on panels here, if anybody knows about an event that I seem to remember reading about. Before the fall of Mussolini's government, some Italian fascist troops actually fought a pitched battle with some Nazi troops to prevent the roundup of some Jews. And I've never found any further information about that. I wonder if anybody knows anything about a possible incident like that.
I will.
Lottare cosa significa? Combattere.
No, I just want to say, I don't know that you need, I've never heard of this, and I think we have studied and read a lot here. I don't know if Susan Zuccotto or Sergio Ruzzato, someone else who has information. Look, one thing to say is that at least, as we know today, 50% of the arrests were carried out by Italians. So probably the percentage is higher. For instance, in Fiume, we have, because there were very few Jews, we have been able to document the arrest, and almost all the arrests were carried out by Italians. So we don't, I mean, I've never heard of this, but it's all possible. If someone one day documents it, we'll know about it. And we're going to close today, but I'm going to... I like to, let me introduce you 1 second, wait.
I have survived Auschwitz and Dachau, but I haven't survived the humiliation of the racial laws. When I was 15, and they told me that I couldn't go back to school, Italian school run by the nuns.
That's 100% right. I was just answering
That's what the Italians are, the ones that you like to protect.
No.